in a way, he kind of personifies just jazz music and people's reaction to it in a certain way that, oh yeah, it's nice and tuneful back then, and then it starts getting into bebop, and, not that he started back so far, but if you look at the arc of his music, how a lot of people see jazz as getting like too out there at a certain point. It used to be about melody, and then it kind of changed over the time.
Right. Well, his interests changed over time. He was his intake of information was really enormous. He was kind of a born researcher, like a born student, and we know a little bit about what he read. We know his son Ravi showed me some of the books that were in his library. He mentioned some other things in the very few letters and some of the interviews that he gave. We know that he was interested in religious history, architecture, science, math, biographies of artists, and he was constantly on learning mode also with other musicians, younger musicians that would come into town. He was very well established by the late 50s because he was with Miles Davis. Then he started to make records on his own, like My Favorite Things, that people really heard. They really heard My Favorite Things on a large scale. It was edited down to actually a kind of radio hit. But then Ornette Coleman came to town, and he wanted to learn from Ornette Coleman. He allowed himself to be really shook up by what he heard, and approached him for lessons. And these are the kind of stories you hear about him, that he was, an extraordinary guy and very ambitious in his own way, but also modest, and never felt like he had the answer. And everything that he says about, when asked about what he's doing in his music, there's this sense of slight worry, that he hasn't quite gotten to where he wants to get to, and he wants to try to do several things at once, include something else into what he's doing. The split for most people with his music comes between the end of his great quartet with Miles Davis, with McCoy Tyner, Elvin Jones, and Jimmy Garrison, and then the next band after that had his wife Alice Coltrane and Rashid Ali. But he wanted to have both bands playing together somehow, so he could have two concepts going simultaneously. So this was the kind of guy he was.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I'm speaking with Ben Ratliff, and we're talking about Coltrane, The Story of a Sound, the book that Ben Ratliff has just had published by FSG. It's almost as if he had a bit of, I don't know if it's frustration, but he's not really dealing with a chordal instrument. And, I mean, with a piano, you could play chords easily.
Mm-hmm.
On a horn, it's a little harder to just do the chords. And it almost seems like he's reaching for a way to play the saxophone as if it were a guitar or a piano or a harp. Mm-hmm.
He loved the harp, and he loved the sound of big arpeggios, almost like a glissando effect. He in general, he had a real hunger for harmony. He wanted to hear the biggest chords possible. He wanted to stack chords on top of each other. Yeah, for sure. And, especially in the very end, you can hear that, like on the record Interstellar Space, where it's just him and Rashid Ali on drums. He's playing these lines that are just enormous, like wipes from up to down the instrument, and they're virtuosic, and it almost sounds like a harp.
Well, there's a story in the book that you mentioned, I think, where he took his arm and laid it down on the piano and all the notes played, and I don't know who he was with then.
Yeah, with Wayne Shorter.
Wayne Shorter, they try to reproduce that sound of the...
Wayne Shorter has some very interesting stories about talking with Coltrane around 58, 59, when Coltrane was, deep in his studies about harmony. It was, around the time, or just before the time of Giant Steps. And, Wayne is a fairly abstract thinker, and they would have fairly far-out conversations about, imagining what it would be like if they could speak their language backwards, or be able to play a written line of music by starting in the middle and going in both directions at the same time, or Coltrane would put his forearm down on the piano and make this big, huge cluster sound, and tell Wayne, see if you can grab as many notes in there as you can with your saxophone. They would do things like that.
Mm-hmm. And to reproduce that, you have to sort of somehow you have to contract time. I mean, obviously, time was a big element of what he was interested in too. I mean,
time became an issue in his music for sure. The direction that it goes in, towards the end of his life, he died in 1967. The direction that his music goes in is toward longer and longer pieces of music and continuous tones. And clearly this had something to do with the fact that he was listening to a lot of Indian music. He and his wife had a very quiet, private existence out in this house in Long Island. They didn't have lots of people over all the time. And they meditated. And that's where his music was going. It was toward, continuous tones, and they seemed to be interested in, masked continuous tones. So maybe he would have gone on to do orchestral pieces or choral pieces or something like that. It seems pretty clear that he wouldn't have just stayed with what we know as free jazz. Because when people get very, very upset about what he did toward the end of his life, people who feel that he led jazz down the wrong path, we're talking about a year and a half, or maybe 2 years. Right. There's so much change. The last 10 years of his life have so much change in them that things would have kept changing. There seems no doubt, and I think we would, if he hadn't died right then, we certainly would have thought about free jazz in a completely different way. More, certainly not as some sort of ending place or some sort of absolute. I think it would have been seen as just, one station along a long road. Right.
I mean, he, of all musicians, probably also is always looking forward. It's always moving forward. So I don't think it sounds as though he would not have been happy stopping at any one place. It's always a progression of some sort, and that he happened to die in that phase of his music is just where he happened to die in that phase.
That's right. Yeah. But beyond that, the whole game of what would he have done after he died is sort of dangerous and silly. Mm-hmm.